around, about 5 years ago, and we were thinking of the 40th anniversary of the party, and I said, it's time for a history. Because I was always very upset that when you read the numerous volumes that have come out over the past decade about the conservative movement in the United States, the Conservative Party only gets a sentence if they're lucky. And I think that's unfair, because what I hope to show you today, or just give you a taste of today, is the impact the New York State Conservative Party had on the national conservative movement, going back to the Goldwater days. And what you should know is this, and particularly the younger people here, there's a great, rich history. The most unlikely state in the nation going back to the early 60s to start a conservative party was New York. And what the founders and the early people in the party were able to prove, that even in New York, not only can you hatch a conservative movement, you could also win an election on the conservative line, as we did in 1970 with the election of James L. Buckley. But let's go back a few decades and just I'll give you a brief overview of those opening days. And again, I hope it gives you a taste to dig deeper into the history of this party. But it was 6 days after the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960 that J. Daniel Mahoney and his brother-in-law, Kieran O'Doherty, went to a gin mill down in Lower Manhattan with a couple of friends of theirs to commiserate about the loss of Richard Nixon to John Kennedy. And what annoyed them more than anything else was the closeness of the election and the fact that the governor of the state of New York, a Republican named Nelson Rockefeller, did not lift a finger to help Richard Nixon win that election. Matter of fact, they were sort of rooting for the other side, because the Rockefeller people were boasting before the numbers were even in election night 1960 that, hey, Nixon's down the rat hole, Rockefeller's going to be president 4 years from now. And it was that afternoon they kicked around, what are we going to do about the Republican Party in New York? And they concluded that, well, it doesn't make sense to try to take on the establishment. It's not going to happen. You couldn't do it under Dewey. You're not going to be able to do it under Rockefeller. So they decided maybe starting a brand new party is the way to go. And that is exactly what happened that afternoon. The late Kathleen Mahoney, wife of J. Daniel, retells that the first night he came home with the election law under his arm and said, hey, guess what, we're going to start a conservative party. And she said, well, you have time for dinner first. I mean, there was this belief that, can this happen? And what one must remember is that these were not rich people. Both Dan Mahoney and Kieran O'Doherty took a leave from their law firms. When this got started, J. Daniel Mahoney, I think, had 4 kids at that time, which grew to 6 kids later on. They were not wealthy men. They both lived out in Queens County. But they decided to take on the establishment, everything that was involved with that. Their legal careers are finished at the firms they took the leave of absence for. They weren't allowed back when it was all over. But I think when you look at these two men, they complemented one another. Bill Buckley described Dan Mahoney as, quote, relaxed, humorous, wise, and a peerless conciliator. On the other hand, he thought Kieran O'Doherty as intense, fascinated by politics, prodigiously informed, with an infinite capacity for righteous indignation. And that was Kieran O'Doherty. They complemented one another. One was very intense, one was very low-key. But to get this movement started took money, it took bodies, and thanks to Bill Buckley and the old crowd at National Review, they provided the mailing lists that went out, a prospectus went out, calling for people of goodwill who were interested in the conservative cause and were upset about Nelson Rockefeller's spending problems, that he was spending the state into bankruptcy, that here's an opportunity to do something about it. Because at that time, the Republican Party was fundamentally still an elitist, progressive type of party. Going back to the days of Charles Evan Hughes and Tom Dewey, they were certainly of the left. They believed that all problems need to be solved required big activist government. They were generally fine on foreign policy, but they believed in big government. And that's the Republican Party that we faced at that time. And the conservatives were not welcome into the Republican Party. Often they were just crushed out of existence, particularly during the Rockefeller days. So we saw an opportunity here to go forward. And thanks to the Democrats who created the third party movement in New York, in particular. What happened is, to put it in a nutshell, Franklin Roosevelt, running for president, knew that there were a lot of progressive Republicans that would never go to the Democratic line. They considered that the party of those corrupt Irish in Lower East Side of Manhattan who ran the Democratic Party out of Tammany Hall. So in order to get their votes, he encouraged the creation of the American Labor Party back in the 40s. And they set up the law that when you cast a vote on the Democratic Party for Franklin Roosevelt, the American Labor Party for Franklin Roosevelt, the votes fell into the same basket. So people who couldn't bring themselves to vote on a Democratic line could still vote for Franklin Roosevelt. The American Labor Party was taken over by the communists, and a crowd broke away that created the Liberal Party, which was the successor to the American Labor Party. And so that's how it all came about. So they gave us the opportunity to start the Conservative Party. At the time, you needed 20,000 signatures, which you know what it is to get signatures. That's a big number. They figured they had to file at least 40,000. They finally did do that by putting together these mailing lists. They had one rally out in the old Garden City Hotel. 800 people came out to a rally in the Garden City Hotel. Later in the year, they had at the Madison Square Garden a rally. In October of 1962, 14,000 people came to a rally at Madison Square Garden, okay? You could still smoke in Madison Square Garden in those days. You'll see the picture in there. Senator Libel, I want to bring that picture to your attention. The point is this. A handful of dedicated people. One man got killed while circulating petitions, got killed on New York State Thruway trying to get rush petitions down in New York right before filing. A hardcore, dedicated group of people, principled people, took on the establishment, and they won. Nelson Rockefeller's and his armies of lawyers couldn't get them thrown off the ballot. It can happen. You can beat the system. And what happened that year is they had to come up with candidates first once they realized they were on the party line. So they put up a businessman out of Syracuse by the name of David Jagwith, a candidate for governor, totally unknown. They spent about $30,000 that fall on the gubernatorial race. But what was interesting is this. You had to get 50,000 votes to survive. The Rockefeller people did everything on the face of the earth to dissuade anyone from voting on the conservative line because they were boasting that Nelson Rockefeller would be reelected to his second term with 1 million votes, and that would get his presidential bandwagon started. And well, the conservatives not only broke the 40,000, they got 140,000 votes. That was the first vote out, November of 1962. And the Daily News wrote at that time, Governor Nelson Rockefeller won re-election easily, though by a reduced plurality. This, we think, was chiefly because of the new Conservative Party. Its nominee, David Jagwith of Syracuse, pulled 120,000 votes, presumably nearly all Republican, meaning Rockefeller and his fellow liberal Republicans had better pay some serious heed to Jagwith and company from here on. The Conservative Party had become a permanent party at that point in time. And in 1964, the Conservative Party, although they could not circulate petitions in the Goldwater movement for delegates, they were certainly part of giving a helping hand in that. Senator Libel's father, Vince Libel, was one of those delegates elected in 1964 for Goldwater. And he worked hand in hand with the Conservative Party at that time to make that movement towards the Rockefeller, towards the Goldwater movement, while everyone in New York was, everyone else in New York was dramatically opposed to it. But in the end of 1964, we know the great disaster of that year. Republicans lost control of both houses of the state legislature. A number of congressmen went down. It was all the Goldwater landslide. And people tried, starting with the New York Times, tried to write off the conservative movement as dead, finished, over. Just a bunch of rednecks down in Alabama belonged to the conservative movement. And what happened as early as 1965 was the rebirth of that movement. And the Conservative Party was primarily responsible for it. Responsible for putting up as a candidate for mayor of the city of New York in 1965, William F. Buckley, Jr. Bill Buckley proved politics could be fun. He wanted to take on a fellow Yalie by the name of John Lindsay, who was one of the most liberal Republican congressmen on the face of the earth. John Lindsay had refused to endorse Barry Goldwater. He repudiated the GOP platform in 1964. He would remind his constituents, quote, I am not running as a Republican, I am running as John Lindsay. And what I always found amazing, I remember as a kid in that campaign, was John Lindsay, this was his slogan on his posters, the district's pride, the nation's hope. That was the pretentiousness of John Lindsay and the liberal crowd at that time. They honestly believed God chose them to lead the world. While Bill Buckley went to Yale, and Bill Buckley knew that John Lindsay was not the brightest thing that came down the street, so I think that was part of the reason why he wanted to run. But what was amazing about that campaign, I was about 13 years old handing out flyers on street corners, guys like Mike Long becoming district leaders in their areas, opening up clubs all over the place. It was an incredible movement in the city of New York. You had the newspaper strike at that time, so the debates became the key. And you had John Lindsay, who proved to himself, he wasn't all that proved to the city, he wasn't that bright. You had Abraham Beam, the Democratic candidate for mayor, who looked like the accountant from the IRS who comes after you. And you had Bill Buckley. you couldn't help but hit a home run, Bill Buckley being in that race. And what you began to see is a change in the movement. Bill Buckley thought a lot of people on the Upper East Side were going to vote for him because he went to Yale, and they realized John Lindsay couldn't match Bill Buckley. His votes came, though, from the outer boroughs. And in 1962, statewide, we got 140,000 votes. By 1965, we got 341,000 votes on the conservative line just in the city of New York. That's the growth you see in a 3-year period. 1 year later, Rockefeller was up for a third term. The Conservative Party put up a little-known professor by the name of Dean Paul Adams out of Rochester, New York. Again, they spent about $40,000. But what was key to that race is Nelson Rockefeller still had some presidential hopes. All right, taxes were beginning to fly. The state fiscally was in bad shape. He was not the most popular man on the face of the earth. And the Conservative Party wanted to outpoll the Liberal Party. That was the goal. And the Liberal Party was very nervous about this, so instead of supporting the Democrat, which was their norm, they put up the biggest name they could find, a professional ne'er-do-well by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Jr., on the Liberal line. He thought he should be crowned for office all his life. He had his father's good looks, but that was about the extent of it. But he went along with this and put himself up there, and the Liberals figured with a couple of $100,000, it was a done deal. They would outpoll the Conservative Party. And it looked at first like they did. And the Liberal Party decided to gloat over the Conservatives by running a full-page ad in the New York Times that proclaimed, "We polled approximately 520,000 votes, the largest in our history. We also maintained our hold of our traditional column C. Had we lost column C to the Conservative Party, it would have been a blow to liberal-minded people throughout the nation." Pretentiousness of these people. Throughout the nation, and front-page news everywhere. Well, lo and behold, when the final votes came out 2 weeks later, they had to eat crow. Conservative Paul Adams received 510,000 votes, and FDR Jr. received 507,000 votes. A jubilant Bill Buckley wrote the New York Times demanding that they refund the Liberal Party the cost of their ad. So we went from 140,000 votes to 212,000 votes to now 510,000 votes statewide. 1968 comes along, and there was, if you remember back then, you had Richard Nixon running for president again. It was the height of the Vietnam War, crime on the streets, law and order was the main issue. You had George Wallace running for president on the independent line. There was some people in the movement, conservative movement, that supported Wallace. It was sort of split. And Dan Mahoney was looking for someone that could unify the party and put up a serious candidate that year against Jacob Javits. And he turned to a very low-key guy that he got to know because this guy was Bill Buckley's campaign manager in the race for mayor, and that was the brother of William Buckley, James L. Buckley, James Lane Buckley. At the time was running the Buckley Family Company, an oil company that they had inherited from their father. He wasn't crazy about doing it, but they sort of talked him into it at the last minute to do it. And Jim Buckley turned out to be a phenomenal candidate. In a very low-key fashion, he took on Jacob Javits, and if you remember, Paul O'Dwyer that year won the Democratic nomination. Jacob Javits was running on the Democratic and Liberal lines. It was the year that, once again, the Republican Party forbid a joint group of electors, so Richard Nixon's name did not appear on the conservative line that year running for president. He was just on the Republican line. It wasn't until 4 years later that the conservatives were allowed by the Republicans to endorse the Republican candidate for president. So keep in mind, you had no top of the ticket. There was nobody there to vote for president. It was just blank. James L. Buckley that year managed to get 1,139,000 votes. Huge number. Think about it. 1962, 140,000 votes. Now we're at 1,000,001 just cast on the conservative line. Actually, Jim Buckley, outpolled the Democratic candidate in Nassau County, Rockland County, Suffolk County, Westchester County, Queens, and Richmond County, Staten Island. Outpolled the Democratic candidate. You began to sense that something was going on. You saw the fundamental breakup of the old Franklin Roosevelt coalition. You saw blue collars, inner city ethnics, basically mostly a Catholic crowd, beginning to break away from the party of Al Smith and Franklin Roosevelt that they grew up in. They felt unwanted in the Democratic Party, which had become an elitist party of snobs. Their hero was Adlai Stevenson. The reform movement in New York politics frowned upon the values of those blue-collar workers in the outer boroughs and outer suburban areas. you saw a shift within the party, and they would not go to the party of Herbert Hoover and Nelson Rockefeller, the Republican Party. The conduit was the Conservative Party, and that's the purpose the party served. And that was not the plan when they originally started. It was a heavy movement of Democrats that started coming over to the Conservative Party. And in '68, you could see it when you looked at the demographics of Jim Buckley getting the 1,000,001. And it was in 1969 that we turned to that Dan Mahoney decided maybe it's time to poke around and throw a few bombs within the Republican Party. And John Lindsay had been mayor for 4 years. He called it Fun City, but if you looked at the finances, the city was rapidly going down the rat hole. They were spending money like drunken sailors. John Lindsay was not a popular man, had no understanding of the city. He was one of these Upper East Side guys who only talked to other Upper East Side Manhattan guys, who only talked to other Upper East Side Manhattan guys. He couldn't find his way in a subway from Midtown Manhattan if his life depended on it. So the last straw that broke the camel's back was the great snowstorm in New York City of 1969, where out of Queens County, you couldn't get out of your house for 8 days because they forgot about there's other parts of the city besides Manhattan. And Dan Mahoney figured it was ripe to challenge an incumbent sitting Republican mayor. They found a guy by the name of John Markey out of Staten Island, was state senator. He early on took the Conservative Party nomination. He was one of the guys who, as early as '64, as a state legislature took on the nomination, because a lot of Republicans were forbidden to take the nomination, state legislators and congressmen in particular in the early years. But here was a man, an unassuming man. You know, he wasn't a dynamic personality, a very decent guy. They had no money whatsoever. It was basically a Conservative Party operation putting together this entire campaign once they got the signatures, the Republicans who volunteered to get the signatures to get on the ballot. But lo and behold, in June of 1969, John Markey beat an incumbent Republican mayor named John Lindsay. He carried every county except Manhattan, which is par for the course. But the point is the changing demographics within even the Republican Party. No longer the great party of the Deweys and the Rockefellers and the Lindsays of Manhattan. The Republican Party mentally was changing and looking towards a more conservative orientation of the way of that party, which would lay the groundwork for other things to happen later on. But John Markey lost the election that fall because the Democrats also nominated that year a conservative Democrat by the name of Mario Procaccino. So you had two conservative Italians running against John Lindsay. Lindsay was just on the liberal line. And he actually got elected by getting only 43% of the vote. But so we were stuck, those of us who lived in New York City, were stuck with him for 4 years. But there was a lesson to be learned from it, which brings us to 1970. Dan Mahoney and some of the boys sat down with Jim Buckley and urged him to run again for the U.S. Senate on the conservative line for the Bobby Kennedy seat. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in the summer of 1968, and Nelson Rockefeller filled the spot with a guy by the name of Charles Goodell. He was a Jamestown, New York congressman. Actually, he was pretty conservative. Rockefeller figured, I'm going to upset no one with this choice. No one can be angry at me with this choice. And initially, no one was. But Charlie Goodell, something cracked once he got into the U.S. Senate, and he decided to make Bobby Kennedy looked conservative in his voting record. He just went as far left as you could go. Critical of Nixon administration, critical of policy in Vietnam, critical of every policy that you could come down to. Matter of fact, Spiro Agnew in the campaign in 1970 referred to him as the Christine Jorgensen of the Republican Party. Now, don't you remember? They sat down with Jim Buckley and said, you got to do this again. They brought in F. Clifton White, the great political operator, the great political campaign manager of his time. It was Clifton White who organized the draft Goldwater movement in 1964 and got Barry Goldwater the Republican nomination. Jim Buckley said, wait a second, before I give up another year of my life, let's take a poll. So they put the money together to take a poll, and it came back that Jim Buckley, just on the conservative line in a three-way race, early in 1970 would get 28% of the vote. And Cliff White concluded, you could win this race. You had Charlie Goodell, who's the Republican liberal candidate. You had a congressman from Westchester County named Dick Ottinger, who was sort of, professional ne'er-do-well. His mother bought him a congressional seat because he couldn't figure out what to do with life. He was a Democratic candidate, and James Buckley, the Conservative Party candidate. It was an incredible campaign. It was really the last of the street corner campaigns. Those of us that were involved, and I was a freshman in college, and you could just feel the juices flowing on street corners. I mean, fist fights would break out. It was a hot campaign. It was the year of the hard hat. It was the year when the Vietnam protests were hot and heavy in 1970 after the bombing of Cambodia. You could feel the juices flowing on the street. And it was an extraordinary campaign. And here we are in the state of New York, the most liberal state, still the biggest and most liberal. California was rapidly about to supersede us. The most liberal state in the nation, and you have this unassuming, low-key guy running for the United States Senate. And you know what? We won. And I was there at the Waldorf Astoria the night of that victory. That place was packed. It was an incredible evening. Absolutely incredible evening. But for going from 140,000 votes in 1962, James L. Buckley was elected to the United States Senate on the conservative line, receiving 2.2 million votes. So it went from 140 to 2.2 million in a matter of 8 years. It was extraordinary. That's an extraordinary history. He was the first man elected to the United States Senate on an independent, not independence, but a party separate from a major and a recognized party that was not the Republican and Democratic Party, the first. And that was a record unto itself. And he spent 6 distinguished years in the United States Senate. But the key is, when you look at the history of the party in that short period of 6 years during one of the most liberal decades of this nation's history, the Conservative Party had a tremendous impact. And as we look to our own future, we have to ask ourselves, where are we going from this point on? I think it's worth looking back on those men and women who were the first people going out there and banging on those doors, getting their signatures, because they prove that you can have an impact and that you can make a difference. And our party is beginning to be an aging party. And it's time for us to have the responsibility to start reaching out to bringing in a younger coterie of people who can carry on this great tradition. And that's the challenge we face at this point in time. Things can get very dreary. We're looking at a fiscal situation in the state of New York, the city of New York, that is bad. Okay. I don't know, I think they've run out of rabbits to pull out of the hat in Albany. And it's going to be interesting to watch, but we have to be ever vigilant. It is the primary purpose for the Conservative Party's existence to make sure that we point the fingers when they have to be pointed, to keep them on an even track before they spend the state into bankruptcy. But we have to begin building on the leadership, the interest in this party, because, again, it's an aging party. So that's the mission we have in this next decade to do. In the first decade of the 21st century, where is this party going? What are we going to do to revitalize it and keep it cooking? Because as we all get older, okay, the ethnic blue collars that were the base of this party are retiring, they're moving, they're dying. Okay. The World War II and Korean veterans who founded this party are an aging population. So we have to think about that future. But by studying the history of this party, I think you will see that a small group of people could have tremendous impact. That's what Kieran O'Doherty and J. Daniel Mahoney did in 1962. And as we sit here in 2003, that's our duty next, to carry on, carry the flame, carry on the message. And I hope we could get together a decade from now and say that we succeeded, that we fought the good fight, we kept the faith. Thank you very much for having me.